It is reported that on June the 24th, an estimated 751 unmarked graves were discovered on the grounds of a former residential school for Indigenous children in Canada. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called it a shameful reminder of the systemic racism, discrimination, and injustice that Indigenous people have faced and continue to face in this country. Do you have any comment?
中方注意到了有关的报道。
We noted relevant reports on the unmarked graves, which came only weeks after a similar story a few weeks ago. With these discoveries, the dark chapter in Canada's history has been revealed little by little, calling it this is a crime against humanity, and Federation of the Sovereign Indigenous Nations chief said, "The only crime we ever committed as children was being born Indigenous." This is an indictment of the Canadian government's historical debt to the Indigenous people. It also reflects the Indigenous community's helplessness in front of their present miserable conditions. According to reports, over 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to leave their families to attend so-called residential schools, where discipline was harsh and conditions worse. The traces of Indigenous people's language and culture were removed. Their daily curriculum is not about learning, but chores. The students were physically and sexually abused and malnourished. More than 4,000 died at such schools. But these schools operated over 100 years in Canada, a country that always boasted about its democracy and civilization. The Maryville Indian Residential School, where the unmarked graves were found, was only closed in 1997. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, after conducting 6 years of research, released an authoritative report concluding that the Canadian residential schools accounted to cultural genocide of Indigenous people. Although the schools were closed, the racial discrimination against Indigenous people in Canada is going on. According to statistics, Indigenous people are 58% more likely to suffer from criminal attacks. Indigenous women are 16 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than white people. Between 1980 and 2015, thousands of Indigenous women were murdered or went missing. The Canadian government has also had to admit that tragic and violent treatment of Indigenous women constitutes genocide. Faced with these historical crimes, the Canadian government has for years talked about taking steps to find out the truth, but done very little about it. With regard to the remains of 215 children that we mentioned before, the Canadian government is shifting the blame onto the Catholic Church. Even the remains themselves were discovered by radar only when social groups had no other choices but to hire people to do the job. Before that, it was all along suspected that human remains were buried at the site of the Indigenous school, but the government didn't do anything. The fact is, there are 139 such Indigenous schools across Canada. We don't know how much crime lies beneath them. We hope the Canadian government will not make verbal apology only and do no more than superficial justice, but rather take more forceful measures to find out the truth, hold perpetrators accountable, provide compensation, and introduce policies to effectively protect the rights of Indigenous people.